Hi there, eToro. It is Monday, the 3rd of April, and that means it's time to take a look at what moved the markets last week. Starting with the most important macro data points that I and many market participants follow, there was a fair amount of good news last week. There was some slightly negative news, but mostly good. So just jumping through a few of them very quickly, we can see that consumer confidence came in much stronger than expected. Pending home sales was expected to fall, but actually increased. CPI within Germany came in slightly higher than expected, and GDP within the US came in slightly lower than expected, so two negative data points there. But then looking at the GDP numbers for the UK, much stronger than anticipated. CPI within the EU region in total, lower than expected. And finally, probably the most watched data point from last week was the core PCE price index. This being the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation, came in 25% lower than had been forecast. So on the whole, the bulk of these data points reflecting a fair amount of health within some leading economies. And this stoked some optimism that we saw in equities, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. Last week, we also did see some further rumblings about the banking crisis, and I think that that will continue to echo for some time to come. However, you can see that the interest in this topic that was terrifying during the time that it was happening is beginning to wane. And this is always the way. There's always a thing that grabs the headlines. It either creates incredible fear or enormous amounts of optimism and hope. And then over time, well, relatively quickly, usually, that fades. Something else interesting that continues to grab headlines, and I think that more and more people are becoming aware of this now, are the fact that we have AI that is incredibly useful and is in some way slightly scary in how versatile and powerful it is. Now, this is already beginning to hit the share prices of a few companies out there. So OpenAI's technology is certainly the one that's grabbing the most headlines at the moment. So this is GPT or ChatGPT, depending on the version that you have access to. And we're now seeing large companies throw their hat in the ring. Google's created Bard, which is their version of ChatGPT. Nowhere near as good. Nowhere near as good. But I expect what we'll see through the next decade is that our use of AI will only increase. And I bet that there are companies out there today, probably smallish private companies, that one day will be the Googles, Amazons, Facebooks of their time. Last week, we also saw this open letter asking for a pause in the AI experiments that are going on. Over the past 12 to 18 months, we've seen the rapid advance in AI. And it's not just that ChatGPT has gotten that much better, because it has, it's that there are other tools out there too with different capabilities that are evolving so quickly that some of the world's leaders in AI, people who have signed this open letter, are concerned about how this technology might be used. Now, it's not that these people think that this AI is going to become sentient and take over the world. They're more concerned that there isn't enough legislation around these technologies. We've all heard about government-sponsored hackers that are used for all kinds of nefarious purposes. Now you can imagine that AI will probably enable any single human hacker to be 10,000 times more effective. These are the types of things that we need legislation and tooling around in order to control. Personally, I am concerned about the way that AI could be used, but I'm also very curious about the problems that it will solve for humanity. Last week, I did also see one of my portfolio companies report earnings. So Micron reports earnings very early in the earnings season. Micron is a semiconductor company, and semiconductor companies are very cyclical. So the health of their business is correlated completely with the economic cycle, and we all know that we're in the trough of the economic cycle at the moment. Now, this was reflected in their earnings report, and given where we are, the earnings report wasn't awful, but probably the most interesting aspect of this earnings report was their forward-looking statements. They do feel as though the market has either reached a bottom or the bottom is rapidly approaching. And that, of course, means that in the near-term future, things will turn around for Micron, which is a fantastically run company and effectively a duopoly in what they do. The stock rallied very nicely on the day following the earnings report. However, later in the week, we saw that China is now retaliating against the US. The US, of course, has reviewed a number of Chinese companies saying that there were security concerns, and it now looks as though China is looking to do a similar thing. This could have a huge impact on Micron as a business. However, I need more details to emerge before I can make that kind of call. While we're on the topic of China, so one of the macro data points that came out last week was with regards to China's service activity, and this is expanding incredibly quickly. Now, if you look at China's macro data points in total, there'll be some that aren't so great, some that seem to be bottoming out, but others that are starting to hint at the fact that the things that the government has been doing are beginning to work. We can see from articles like this that the government has taken this very seriously. The government has done a number of things in order to try and stoke the domestic market, and you can see that they are now working with the international community, trying to bring more business onto their shores. It takes a long time to rebuild confidence in a market after a collapse the size of which we saw in China, but it does look as though that confidence is beginning to return. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of optimism through the week, and we can see that in the major US indices, such as the S&P 500, from 2 Fridays ago until Friday last, the index appreciated by 3.5% or so. And for the predominantly tech-focused NASDAQ 100, we saw an appreciation of 3.29% over the same time frame. All right, so what about this week? Well, it's going to be a shorter week because we start to celebrate Easter towards the end of this week. But there are a lot of macro data points coming out of the US specifically about jobs. So we can see that we'll get JOLTS on Tuesday. We can see we get non-farm payrolls on Friday, jobless claims on Thursday, and sorry, I missed it, but the unemployment rate in the US on Friday too. What about earnings? I did say that Micron has restarted the next earnings season. Well, Micron tends to be very early, and so you can see on screen today is the 3rd of April, that earnings season for the majority of companies only kicks off in roughly 2 weeks, as it usually does with all of the big banks. All right, so that's it for this week. There hasn't been a lot of excitement following the banking crisis that's been rumbling on for the 3 weeks or so preceding that. The next key events that will be market moving, I believe, will be the CPI data that we'll be getting out of the US next week, as well as the earnings that we see out of companies beginning in 2 weeks' time or so. All right, have a good one. Speak to you soon. Goodbye.